For the third time in 3 years, Naples just recorded its strongest earthquake in 40 years. And this time, buildings actually came down. Today is Saturday, August 1st, 2026, and I want to give you the complete picture of what happened last night in Italy's Campi Flegrei volcanic region, because this story has layers that most coverage is glossing over in favor of dramatic thumbnails. We're going to walk through exactly what struck west of Naples on Friday evening, why officials are calling it an unprecedented event for this monitoring network. What's actually driving this multi-year pattern of escalating quakes, and what the genuine scientific research, not the speculation, says about where this goes from here. I also want to spend real time on the history here, because Campi Flegrei has been doing this for centuries, and understanding that history is the difference between panicking over a headline and actually understanding the risk. Let's start with the facts on the ground, because they're serious enough without any embellishment. On Friday evening, July 31st, at 1946 local time, a magnitude 4.7 earthquake struck the Campi Flegrei caldera just west of central Naples, with its epicenter close to the Solfatara crater between the towns of Pozzuoli and Quarto. The quake was shallow, only about 3 kilometers deep, which is exactly the kind of depth that produces intense, jarring surface shaking even from a moderate magnitude. Italy's civil protection officials confirmed this is the strongest earthquake recorded in this specific area since continuous instrumental monitoring of the caldera began, surpassing 2 previous magnitude, 4. 6 events recorded back in 2025. The shaking was felt sharply not just across Naples and its surrounding hinterland, but out on the islands of Procida and Ischia as well, where residents reported the ground moving distinctly enough to send people out into the streets. In the hours that followed, the region didn't get a moment of calm. More than 60 aftershocks were recorded through the night, part of a broader swarm that included over 30 distinct tremors in the first evening alone. The strongest of these aftershocks reached magnitude 3, 8, striking around 10 o'clock that night in the Gulf of Pozzuoli, with another notable jolt of magnitude 3, one arriving early Saturday morning. Italy's civil protection minister, Nello Musumeci, gave a direct, unambiguous statement to the public. The seismic swarm is continuing, and further earthquakes above magnitude 3 remain a real possibility in the near term. That's not hedge language. That's an official telling residents plainly that this isn't over. The human cost so far is significant, even though, and I want to be precise about this, it could have been dramatically worse. Reported injury figures have varied slightly between sources as the picture develops, but the consistent range is somewhere between 21 and 26 people injured, with 2 individuals hospitalized in serious condition. The overwhelming majority of injuries came from falling debris, masonry, facade fragments, and sections of collapsing walls striking people in the street rather than structures fully collapsing on top of occupants. Several unoccupied buildings did collapse outright, and notably, part of a rocky cliff face bordering one of the caldera's craters crumbled during the shaking. A detail that tells you something important about just how unstable the ground itself has become in the most active parts of this region. Independent of building construction quality, structural damage assessments have been an ongoing process rather than a single clean count. Initial reports on Friday night put displaced residents at around 250 people. By Saturday, as building-by-building inspections continued, that number had grown, with at least 8 to 9 buildings formally declared unsafe and roughly 290 residents from about 130 families ordered out of their homes, and officials were explicit that this number is expected to keep climbing as more properties get checked. A fire also broke out at a youth detention center in the aftermath of the quake, prompting immediate calls from local officials for its closure over safety concerns, layering an additional emergency onto an already stretched response effort. Infrastructure across the region took a serious hit as well. The historic Cumana and Circumflegrei rail lines, the commuter lines that serve the towns scattered across the caldera itself, were suspended entirely. Broader regional and high-speed rail services saw delays exceeding 6 hours before gradually resuming. Perhaps most disruptive for daily life in the area, the port of Pozzuoli was shut down entirely. And that's not a minor inconvenience, because that port is the primary mainland gateway for ferry traffic to the islands of Procida and Ischia, both of which are packed with tourists during peak summer season. Cutting that link off, even temporarily, stranded travelers and disrupted the local economy at exactly the point in the calendar when it depends most heavily on that tourism traffic. And then there's the simple human detail that tells you more about the mood on the ground than any casualty figure could. Dozens of families chose to spend the night not in their homes, and in many cases, not even in the official emergency shelters, but sleeping in their own cars or gathered in open spaces set up by Italy's Civil Protection Department. That's a very reasonable, very deliberate precaution. In the days immediately following a main shock like this, the highest probability of a larger aftershock is in that same short window. And people who lived through it clearly understood that instinctively, whether or not anyone told them the statistics. Italy's Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, Antonio Tajani, addressed the situation directly, saying he had personally spoken with the prefect of Naples and was closely following developments in Pozzuoli, committing the government to full assistance for displaced residents and to what he described as a lasting solution for the redevelopment and safety of every building declared unfit for use. Now, I want to properly explain what Campi Flegrei actually is, because I think this is the part most coverage rushes past in favor of the word supervolcano, and that word alone, without context, tends to generate more fear than understanding. Campi Flegrei, the Phlegreian fields, if you translate it directly, is not a mountain. It doesn't look like Vesuvius, its far more famous neighbor sitting just 20 kilometers to the east across the Bay of Naples. Instead, it's a caldera, a vast sunken depression roughly 130 square kilometers in size, stretching from the western suburbs of Naples out along the coastline around Pozzuoli and Boccoli. That depression exists because tens of thousands of years ago, this area experienced two genuinely catastrophic eruptions. The first, around 39,150 years before present. The second, roughly 15,000 years ago. Eruptions so massive that ash from them has been found layered across large stretches of Europe and even into Russia, and which are believed to have played a role in altering climate conditions across the region for a period afterward. What's left today isn't one crater, but more than 24 scattered craters, cones, and volcanic vents across that whole depression, with the Solfatara crater near Pozzuoli, where Friday's quake was centered, being among the most continuously active in terms of both seismicity and geothermal venting. Geologically, Campi Flegrei sits within what's known as the Campanian volcanic arc, part of the same broader tectonic system responsible for Vesuvius and the volcanic islands further along the Italian coast, all ultimately tied to the slow subduction of the African tectonic plate beneath the Eurasian plate. Its most recent actual eruption was back in 1538, a comparatively small but genuinely dramatic week-long event that built an entirely new hill from scratch, known today as Monte Nuovo, still standing as physical proof of just how quickly this landscape can reshape itself when the system does become active. Since then, the caldera has cycled through long periods of relative quiet, interrupted by episodes of unrest, documented activity in the 1950s, again in the 1970s, and then a genuinely serious crisis in the early 1980s that remains the most important historical comparison for understanding what's happening today. That 1980s crisis is worth walking through in detail because it's the benchmark every official statement about strongest since is measuring against. During that episode, the ground beneath Pozzuoli rose by more than 6 feet, an extraordinary amount of uplift in a relatively short window, accompanied by more than 16,000 individual earthquakes. The scale of that unrest was severe enough that authorities made the decision to evacuate roughly 40,000 residents from the town as a precaution against a feared eruption. That eruption never came. The crisis eventually subsided, the evacuated residents largely returned, and the caldera settled into a quieter, though never fully dormant, state for the following 2 decades. That quiet ended around 2005. And this is the point where the story connects directly to what happened Friday night. Since 2005, Campi Flegrei has been in what INGV, Italy's National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, describes as an active phase of accelerating bradyseism. Bradyseism, for anyone unfamiliar with the term, refers to the slow rising and falling of the ground surface driven by the filling or emptying of magma chambers and hydrothermal fluid systems deep underground. Think of it less as a single pressure buildup racing toward one release, and more as an enormous, slow-breathing system, where fluid and gas movement beneath the surface gradually pushes the ground upward over months and years, generating mechanical stress in the overlying rock that periodically releases as earthquakes. Since that 2005 restart, the ground near Pozzuoli has risen by more than 140 centimeters in total, well over 4 feet, and recent monitoring has clocked an ongoing uplift rate of roughly 10 millimeters per month, alongside geochemical sampling that consistently shows the underlying hydrothermal system continuing to heat up and release increasing volumes of fluid and gas. And here's the pattern I think is genuinely the most important thing to understand from this entire story. The seismicity tracking that uplift hasn't been rising in a smooth, predictable line. It's been rising in a series of escalating record-breaking jumps, each one described at the time as the strongest in decades. In May of 2024, a magnitude 4 quake struck the region, described then as the strongest ever recorded around the Phlegreian fields, according to INGV volcanologist Giuseppe De Natale, prompting the evacuation of a women's prison near Pozzuoli, along with roughly 40 families from nearby apartment buildings. Barely more than a year later, in June of 2025, that record was broken by not one, but 2 separate magnitude 4, 6 events. And now, just over a year after that, Friday's magnitude 4. 7 quake has broken the record again, the third consecutive strongest in this monitoring era earthquake in roughly 2 years. That trajectory, 3 successive record-breaking events in such a short span, is precisely why officials are treating this differently than they treated the smaller swarms earlier in this decade, and precisely why I framed this story as a serious turn rather than simply another data point in a long-running pattern. I want to be very careful here, though, the same way I've tried to be with every story like this on this channel, because there is a meaningful difference between an accelerating trend and a confirmed forecast. INGV's official position after Friday's quake has been consistent with its statements following previous seismic episodes in this region. There is currently no indication of imminent eruption risk tied to this specific event. Italian authorities did not order a formal evacuation of Naples or its broader metropolitan area. Residents were urged to remain calm, to stay in open areas where practical, and to follow official guidance rather than react to the more sensational versions of this story that were already spreading online within hours of the quake. That distinction matters. An accelerating, record-breaking pattern of seismicity is a genuinely serious scientific signal worth tracking closely. It is not, on its own, proof that an eruption is imminent, and the scientists actually monitoring this system in real time have not made that claim. That said, I don't want to undersell the legitimate research pointing toward longer-term concern either, because there's real peer-reviewed and preprint level science here that goes beyond just counting earthquakes. A study posted earlier this year in April 2026 analyzed the accelerating pattern of seismic activity and ground deformation together and proposed that Campi Flegrei may be approaching what the researchers describe as a critical mechanical transition within the next decade, with some of the analysis pointing toward a window around 2033. I want to be precise about what that phrase actually means, because it's doing a lot of work and it's easy to misread. The researchers are explicit that the exact nature of that eventual transition, whether it ends up being a larger eruption, a series of smaller, more localized explosive events, or simply the system settling into a different, still non-eruptive phase of ground movement, remains genuinely unknown. This is a scientific projection about mechanical thresholds in the rock itself reaching a breaking point under sustained stress, not a claim about a specific eruption date circled on a calendar. Separately, and I think this is one of the more genuinely useful pieces of recent research, a team including scientists from Stanford's Center for Induced and Triggered Seismicity used AI-assisted analysis of seismic data to map hidden fault structures beneath Pozzuoli specifically. Work built on data covering the period from 2022 through 2025. That analysis revealed 2 previously unclear fault lines converging directly beneath the town, and the study's co-author noted that these fault structures are long enough that an earthquake in the magnitude 5 range is not out of the question going forward. I want you to sit with that for a second, because Friday's magnitude 4. 7 event was already the strongest this modern monitoring network has ever recorded. And credible, published research is now suggesting the underlying fault geometry could support something noticeably larger still. That's a genuinely different tier of concern than what officials were discussing even just a year or 2 ago, and it's a big part of why this particular quake is getting treated as a serious inflection point rather than just another entry in a long list of Campi Flegrei tremors. Let's talk about who's actually living through this, because the human scale here is genuinely enormous and often gets flattened into a single statistic. More than 500,000 people live within the Italian government's officially designated red zone. The 15 municipalities considered at highest risk if unrest in this caldera were to escalate rapidly toward an eruption scenario. Zoom out further, and the broader Naples metropolitan area sitting within potential exposure range of a larger event totals more than 3 million people, making Campi Flegrei, by sheer population density and exposure, one of the single most consequential volcanic hazard zones anywhere on the planet, arguably more dangerous in human terms than far more famous volcanoes, precisely because so many people live directly on top of it rather than in its shadow. That reality isn't lost on the Italian government, and it hasn't been a reactive afterthought. Back in 2023 and 2024, well before this latest quake, officials updated the country's mass evacuation contingency planning, specifically in response to the steadily climbing activity levels through that period. Those plans exist, they've been refined multiple times, and they're built around exactly the kind of scenario unfolding right now, not a plan being improvised on the fly after Friday night. But a framework that's been tested against this region's specific geology and population density for years. For the people who actually live in Pozzuoli and the surrounding towns, though, this isn't an abstract planning exercise. It's daily life, and it's worth spending a moment on what that's actually like, because it's a genuinely unusual way to exist. This is a community where sulfurous fumes visibly rise from the ground in places, where the smell of the volcano is simply part of the air, and where the earth beneath your house can be measurably higher or lower than it was a decade ago. Longtime residents have described a kind of hard-won familiarity with the volcano's moods. Not indifference, but a lived understanding that the trembling comes and goes, that some nights bring nothing and other nights bring an earthquake violent enough to crack a wall. At the same time, this latest, most damaging event has pushed some families to make decisions they'd been putting off for years, relocating to nearby towns outside the most active parts of the caldera, choosing not to rebuild in a home that's now been declared structurally unsafe. That tension between deep, generational attachment to a place and a rational, data-backed acknowledgement of rising risk is really the emotional core running underneath all of this seismic data, and it's not going away, regardless of what INGV's instruments say next. So let's talk about what actually happens from here